Hello and welcome. Europe is rearming. The current slogan is Peace through Strength. President Macron of France went on national TV to tell the French people, and by extension all the citizens of the EU, that, the Russians are coming. Well, not quite, but it did have a whiff of Cold War about it. President Macron declared that Russia is a threat to Europe, and therefore France and Europe need to rearm. President Putin, while attending a public event, commented on the French president's address to the nation with what I would describe as a theatrical whisper that seems to say that they, meaning France and Europeans, always want to take Russia down, but Napoleon and Hitler failed. As President Macron is French, let's have a look at Napoleon. A brief recap, of course. Napoleon rose through the ranks, took control of the French Republic, and crowned himself emperor in 1804. He went through Europe faster than I can get through a box of chocolates, then headed for Moscow. He won plenty of battles along the way. And this is him on the way to Moscow. And this is him on the way back from Moscow. Napoleon won plenty of battles, but lost the war. Sakharova, Lavrov, and eventually Peskov commented, "In short, the Kremlin does not share President Macron's opinion, and President Macron's high opinion of himself." Having said that, President Macron's speech was received as aggressive towards Russia, not as President Macron intended, I think, as a call to the French people to unite and defend Europe and Europe's values. Macron accused Russia of interfering with democracy, specifically in Moldova and Romania. This is unfortunate. I talked about Moldova in a previous video. Here I will say that the EU has poured large amounts of money into Moldova for projects with a very wide-ranging scope and fairly limited oversight. By comparison, the Russian money sent to anti-EU and pro-Russian candidates can be defined as peanuts. By the way, although I like to dot the I's, I personally believe that Moldova could benefit from joining the EU. If mentioning the elections in Moldova was unfortunate, doubling down on Romania was a bit of a home goal. You may be aware that the presidential elections in Romania were annulled by the Constitutional Court. And this is one of the reasons behind Romania's downgrade from a flawed democracy to a hybrid regime in the Democracy Index. By the way, one of the runners-up, Elena Lasconi, complained about the Constitutional Court decision and called it trampling on democracy. And she went on to suggest that the decision was influenced by the Social Democratic Party, PSD, wanting their candidate to win. The issue is ongoing. Romanian President Klaus Iohannis, who declassified documents that aided the Constitutional Court in the decision to annul the election, resigned, and the actions of the Constitutional Court and their legality are under review. President Macron states that Russia organizes digital attacks on our hospital, manipulates our opinions with lies on social media. It tests us in the air, in the sea, in space, and behind our screens. I think this needs some unpacking. With regards to cyber attacks on France and the EU, some attacks are state-sponsored, but the majority are about money, such as data theft. The data is then sold on the black market. Another example is ransomware, where you pay the hacker to regain access to your system or your data. A good channel to keep up on this on YouTube is Cyber News. The top state sponsors of cyber attacks are Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, if you do your search in English. A search in Russian returns the US and mainly the Lazarus Group from North Korea. In Europe, it is a bit of a hobby to blame social media for all ills. I prefer pro-EU, pro-US, pro-NATO, overall moderate, centrist, mainstream media, but it is my choice. There are many alternative sources of information I could access, and that drives the old gatekeepers absolutely nutty. Since the beginning of the war, there have been airspace violations by Russian missiles and drones in neighboring countries on their way to Ukraine. Spying with satellites, ships and submarines, it's something that every country that has the capabilities does. So, as President Macron does not cite examples, it is difficult to pin down specific incidents. And I don't think that he is referring to the damaged communication cables in the Baltic Sea, as the incident was investigated and the Swedes ruled out sabotage. President Macron states that Russia is planning to increase their military. As my French is just about good enough to order coffee and cake and buy insane amounts of cheese, I cannot be sure what President Macron intended when he said that Russia has allocated over 40% of its budgets to the military. What I could find is that according to the Russians, military expenditure is 6.3% of GDP and 32.5% of the federal budget. Polish researchers do suggest that the likely expenditure will be over 40% of the federal budget. I think the truth is somewhere in between, and of course, inflation, stubbornly hovering around 10% in Russia, has an effect on how much stuff your rubles can buy. President Macron cites the Minsk agreement as a sign that Russia does not respect agreements. However, both sides, Ukraine and Russia, did not implement Minsk I or Minsk II. The parties were under international diplomatic pressure to sign the agreements, but ultimately there were aspects that were not acceptable to Ukraine and Russia. Each side broke ceasefires and failed to implement their side of the agreement. An interesting point about Minsk is that Ukraine and Russia, as well as the international mediators, mainly France and Germany, had very different understandings of what Minsk required each party in the conflict to do and when. In my opinion, the looseness in the agreements hints to a simple reality for Europe. Life is better in Europe when we are on good terms with Russia. Ukraine, not that important. President Macron tried to revive Minsk in 2019 in the Paris-Normandy summit. Again, each side blamed the other for not doing their bit. However, President Zelensky, on his part, tried to rein in the most extreme nationalists and convince them of the importance of making the agreements reached in Paris work. It may have worked given enough time, but then COVID hit and all talking stopped. And in my opinion, the situation at the time was not helped by President Putin and his low opinion of both Macron and Zelensky as statesmen. President Macron in 2022, days away from the beginning of the invasion, made numerous attempts to get President Putin back to the negotiating table and avoid all-out war. As you well know, it didn't work out. President Macron rallying the French nation need a bit of context. The president is in his second and last term. His re-election in 2022 depended in part on other parties not putting forward popular candidates, so that the final showdown would be between the centrist moderate Macron and the far-right Marine Le Pen from the National Rally. Nonetheless, Macron's popularity is in decline, and the 2024 legislative elections returned a fractured parliament, where President Macron's alliance lost its majority. In such context, it is unlikely that Macron's side will be able to push through the structural changes needed to bring France's budget back into EU's budgetary requirements. President Macron's speech seemed to be using this scenario of an external threat to build up cohesion and consensus in society. And President Macron's suggestion that EU budgetary requirements to be suspended or amended to allow increased spending in defense may help France to meet EU budget rules without having to push internal reforms. Having said all that, I think it is better to strip off defense political rhetoric and focus on what is left. The United States have been warning Europe against defense cuts since 2010. Obama repeated the warning, Trump did too, but in a more, let's say, Trumpian way. And Biden hinted at it as well. So let's see how this scenario fits for size. President Macron pays a visit to the White House. Information is shared with the President of France, behind closed doors, I'm guessing. President Macron comes back and tells the French people, and by extension the whole of the EU, we need to rearm. My very personal hunch is that the Americans believe confrontation is coming, and that the US by itself may not be able to cover for us. Where does that leave Ukraine? Not in a good place. War is going on, the future is even more uncertain, and sadly, when a country's sovereignty depends on foreigners, more often than not, that country ends up with no sovereignty and shaky peace. And finally, last month's results of opinion polls conducted in Russia by the Levada Center. Support for President Putin, the government, and approval of how the country is being run are all up a little from last month. And both the Consumer Sentiment Index and the Social Sentiment Index are up, showing that economic, employment concerns and concerns for one's future as well as the future of the country have eased off in favor of a relatively more positive outlook. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Have a lovely day. Bye bye.